Enter Ukraine. NATO set itself up in Kiev immediately after it became independent and declared in 2008 that it would become a member of the alliance. It was a gross violation of the promises indisputably given to the last Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, but such was the unipolar we can do whatever we want sentiment. In an autistic manner, NATO refused to listen to Russia's legitimate security concerns and also did not bother about the fact that there was only a tiny minority among the Ukrainian people in favor of membership of NATO. Instead, a regime change in Kiev was all that was needed, installing a pro-Western leadership, paying it well, and giving it an offer it could not refuse by wooing it step by step into the ever-expanding alliance.
Why the United States doesn't dare to completely anger Russia. The reason the United States doesn't dare to completely provoke Russia is because Russia possesses a weapon system capable of destroying the Earth, known as the dead hand system. The dead hand system was proposed and built by the Soviet Union during the Cold War in the 1980s. Its original function was designed to automate nuclear weapons. In simple terms, if Russia were to be hit by a nuclear strike, then the dead hand system would automatically initiate a counterstrike, igniting and launching all nuclear missiles, and then carrying out a global nuclear counterattack. Putin once said, "What's the point of the world without Russia?" The dead hand system is also called the perimeter system, and it exists in 3 states: dormant, awake, and launch. Normally, the dead hand system is in a dormant state, unnoticed by most people, but in reality, it constantly monitors data transmitted from various Russian monitoring stations. By precisely analyzing data on nuclear radiation, earthquakes, etc., the dead hand system can determine whether its homeland has been attacked with nuclear weapons. Upon analyzing and determining that its homeland has been attacked, it would immediately react, transitioning from a dormant state to an awake state. Next, the dead hand system would attempt to contact the nation's highest leader. If the leader is unreachable, it would assume that the country's leadership has been compromised, and then it would attempt to contact the next in command, repeating this process until no leaders can be found. At that point, the dead hand system would assume that its country has been overrun and would swiftly switch to nuclear launch mode, subsequently issuing a global strike command, which could lead to the destruction of the entire world.
If we intervene in Western Ukraine, the Russians will be ready for that. And the consequences for us and for NATO will be devastating, because we are not ready to fight the Russians.
Why?
Oh, I think the readiness has been on the decline for a long time. You've had an almost steady, uninterrupted decline in the discipline that makes soldiers fight. Discipline is a tough thing. We don't always understand it. Discipline is really a form of habit. And you build those habits over time through repetition, but you also build it under stress, under pressure, so that it sinks in. And then you build cohesion within the framework of those units. You don't build cohesion when you're dividing the force on racial grounds, when you're pushing people who are clearly unqualified up the ranks to command, when you're rewarding people for anything other than demonstrated character, competence, and intelligence. All of those things are demoralizing, destructive to military establishments. The Army and the Marines are suffering with it, so is the Air Force and the Navy. And there's no easy fix. And these cracks, that are just cracks at the moment, will become giant fissures if you go to war.
We are the principal cause of the war in Ukraine. If we, after the Cold War ended with the Soviet Union, we had left Europe, or just stayed put and not expanded NATO eastward, we would not have this conflict in Ukraine. We are the principal cause of the war in Ukraine. And I actually believe, not to be unfair to Peter, but I think it's folks thinking like you who believe that the United States has a responsible to manage every nook and cranny of the world that facilitates NATO expansion and leads to these sorts of
But it was
problems.
Hungary and Poland and the Czech Republic and other Eastern European and Central European powers that wanted the Americans to look after their security.
There are all sorts of people who want us to look after their security. There's no question about that. But if a country wants us to look after their security and it doesn't make sense from our point of view, then we shouldn't do it. We should do what's in the American national interest.
Peter Vargas.
big chunk of Ukrainian territory. Now, the Russians have now annexed a big chunk of Ukrainian territory. The Russians now believe that that territory belongs to them. Do you think the Russians are going to be willing to abandon that territory in addition to Crimea? I don't think that's happening. The Ukrainians, for their part, insist on getting that territory back, and the Americans would not be willing to concede that territory to the Russians because it would appear to be a defeat for the West. The United States and its allies are in this one to win, right? We are deeply committed. For us to back off and give the Russians any major concessions is just unacceptable at this point. That's the territorial issue. Then there's the question of whether or not Ukraine is neutral. The Russians insist that Ukraine has to be neutral. The Ukrainians are now saying we're willing to be neutral, but we need a guarantee for our security from someone. Well, the only someone that can guarantee Ukrainian security is really NATO, and specifically the United States and its European allies, right? But then Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO, and that's unacceptable to the Russians. So there's no way you're going to get a truly neutral Ukraine that's not affiliated with the West. It's not going to happen, and the Russians are not going to accept that.
There's one thing Putin wants above all else: to keep Ukraine and other former Soviet countries out of NATO forever. Imagine if America's neighbors Mexico and Canada wanted to get into a military alliance with Russia. The US would do everything in its power to prevent that from happening, including violence and intimidation. That's because a deal like that would open up the door for Russian troops, weapons, and nuclear missiles to be placed right outside America's doorstep. And this is exactly what the US has been doing since the Soviet Union fell, even when they promised the Russians they wouldn't. That is what Putin really wants. No NATO for the former Soviet countries, especially Ukraine, the former crown jewel of the Soviet Union. So in January, a month before the invasion, Putin offered a treaty with the US saying exactly that. No more NATO expansion on their doorstep. And as predicted, the US turned him down flat, taking the moral high ground about not negotiating with bullies.
The fact of the matter is we never were willing to negotiate at all on those two demands. At all. And instead, we basically just claimed they were a pretext by the Russians for an invasion.
Putin couldn't get what he wanted by playing fair, so he decided to take it up a notch. He invades Ukraine. He obviously thought he was going to be successful and take over the whole country, but even the invasion wasn't successful. He knew that with the EU's dependency on his natural gas, they'll eventually have to cave in and give him what he originally wanted.
Putin's calculus is to go as far and as deep as he can go, so that he could eventually negotiate himself back out in a way that leaves him with what he originally wanted in the first place.
I think this just goes to show you that if you're going to sort of engage in proactive foreign policy, you need to make sure that domestically you don't have any Achilles heels. And Europe had a massive Achilles heel, which is energy.
They're going to have to take this much more seriously going into next year, because they've enabled a madman.
When Russian troops moved towards Kiev, the EU also got on their moral high ground and pulled out all their big geopolitical guns. As Putin predicted, Europe sanctioned Russia and put up a good fight. Like Germany, who refused to certify Russia's newest pipeline, Nord Stream 2. It was Russia's brand new shiny twin to Nord Stream 1. And without Germany's approval, it's just sitting there completely unused. And when the two countries attempted peace negotiations, the West warned this was a bad idea. Europe insisted that Putin is not to be negotiated with under any circumstances, while somehow not thinking that Russia would use the only card they had.
Ukraine has already lost. And the argument I would make is Ukraine has now lost 20+% of its territory. And we know from the counteroffensive last year that there's no way that Ukraine is going to take back that territory. So that territory is lost. The question is, what does the war look like going forward? My argument is that moving forward, Ukraine is going to lose more territory. more people are going to die. And the principal reason this is the case is that this is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, the balance of manpower, the balance of artillery, and the balance of air power all matter greatly. And if you look at all three of those balances, they are decisively against Ukraine right now, and they only get worse with the passage of time. Just take artillery.
The truth is, if Ukraine had kept its nuclear weapons, I don't think Putin would have done this. And secondly, if Ukraine had been fast-tracked into NATO, I don't think Putin would have done this. He would not have attacked a NATO country, knowing that there is that agreement that if you attack one of them, they all attack you back. So in a way, it's chicken and the egg, isn't it? It's who you believe. You have you seem a firm conviction that we should take Vladimir Putin at his word.
The United States this week then shocked the world and basically admitted that there's no way that Ukraine wins this war. It's over, and it's pushing Ukraine towards peace talks. But Zelensky is not interested in peace talks. He wants every Ukrainian man to die, of course. He asked this week to change the military recruiting standards once again, and he officially canceled the Ukrainian elections. Yes. So desperate people do desperate. The United States this week then shocked the world and basically admitted that there's no way that Ukraine wins this war. It's over, and it's pushing Ukraine. The United States this week then shocked the world and basically admitted that there's no way that Ukraine wins this war. It's over, and it's pushing Ukraine towards peace talks. But Zelensky is not interested in peace talks. He wants every Ukrainian man to die, of course. He asked this week to change the military recruiting standards once again, and he officially canceled the Ukrainian elections. Yes. So desperate people do desperate things. Meanwhile, Putin, really stunning moves that caught the West totally off guard and really show that the United States-led global world order is fracturing before our eyes. So first, Putin signed a new law that removes Russia from the nuclear test ban treaty. This is basically a threat of nuclear use without having to actually threaten nuclear use. Putin's approval of the de-ratification law was posted then on a government website, which said the decision took immediate effect. Yeah, didn't the Western media last week say that Putin was dead? Okay. Russia's parliament has already approved this step. So this means Russia could literally test nuclear weapons, something it hasn't done since 1990.
Here is the real reason why Putin decided to invade Ukraine, a topic that's been stirring up a lot of discussions. You see, most people point to the fact that Ukraine could potentially join NATO, and the common belief is that Russia doesn't want NATO right at its doorstep. But if you think about it, that doesn't quite add up. Why? Because Russia is home to the world's largest nuclear arsenal. So even if NATO were to surround Russia, it's highly unlikely that anyone would dare to cross the Russian border. Now, let's talk economics. Russia, in this arena, is considerably weaker than powerhouses like the European Union and China. But here's the twist. With Ukraine and Belarus in its corner, Russia suddenly becomes a force to be reckoned with, stronger than any individual European country. So, what's the game plan here? It's about joining forces, not just for the sake of power, but to strategically dismantle the European bloc. By aligning with Ukraine and Belarus, Russia isn't just boosting its strength. It's also trying to fragment the unity of Europe to deal with each European country on a one-on-one basis. This tactic isn't just about gaining ground. It's about influence. It's a chess move to gain more control over Europe, even more than the United States, and to effectively push the US out of the European equation. This strategy, if successful, could reshape the balance of power in Europe, shifting the scales in Russia's favor.
Hello friends, we come to the end already. Have you subscribed yet? Yes, press the subscribe button and the like button and the share button. Thank you and have a nice day.